it is my pleasure to turn the program over to our director of the Kravis Leadership Institute and the Stephen L. Eggert Professor of Leadership and George R. Roberts Fellow, David Day. David?
Thank you, Evan, for that great introduction. And thank you all for joining us on this session. It's actually a reprise of something that we did in our most recent advisory board meeting for KLI back in April, and had a really robust discussion around the impact of the pandemic and how it's going to change work, how it's going to change organizations. We're asked to continue that for the alums. So it's a pleasure to be here. As Evan said, my name's David Day. I'm the academic director of KLI. I'm also a professor of psychological science, but my background in psych is in organizational psychology. So my PhD is in industrial organizational psychology, or in Europe, it's called work psychology. So I'm all about the work, and we've been talking about the future of work, it seems like, for years and years, and now suddenly it's here. So before we get into talking about some of the issues related to the future of post-pandemic work and leadership implications, it's my pleasure to introduce 4 of our outstanding alums and KLI board members. First, let me introduce Daniel Kahn, class of 09. Dan is the co-founder and chief operating officer of Cruise Automation. It's a San Francisco-based developer of autonomous vehicle technology, and it's appropriate that he is in a vehicle attending the meeting today. In March of 2016, his startup was sold to General Motors, but continues to operate as its own entity, where Dan remains the company's CEO. In 2016, Dan was number 7 on Fortune's 40 Under 40. Welcome, Dan. Next up, and I'm doing this alphabetically, is John Michael Lind, class of 86. JM Lind is the founding principal of the SPL group of companies and a trustee of the Lind Family Trust and the Lind Family Office. JM is also a director and co-founder of Access Health International. In addition to his degree from CMC, he also has a JD from the University of California, Hastings College of Law, and was the editor of the International Law Review at that time. Next up is Michelle Oden, class of 94. Michelle is a partner principal of People Advisory Services at EY, formerly known as Ernst & Young. She has 20 years of experience in planning and implementing large-scale transformational change to enhance organizational performance. Her core experience is in IT and business transformation. She's also had significant experience in the media and entertainment industries as well. Welcome, Michelle. And our 4th panelist is Brittany Ruiz, class of 08. Brittany is an associate at Latham & Watkins, LLP, in the corporate department at Latham & Watkins, which is a global law firm with more than 30 offices, and she is a member of the Capital Markets Practice Group. Her practice primarily includes representation of investment banks and issuers in public and private security offerings, with an emphasis on initial public offerings and high yield debt securities. At some point, Brittany will explain all that to me because it's over my head. But she's also a member of Latham's Diversity Leadership Committee, which oversees diversity initiatives firm-wide. So welcome, panelists. I'd like to start with a question around disruption. We know when we talked about the future of work, it was something that was in the future, and suddenly the future became the present back in March of 2020. So one of the things I'd like you to think about and reflect on are, what are some positive disruptions as well as negative disruptions that you experienced in your work and your organizations? So if you could keep it to, say, one big negative, because we know there were a lot of negatives, but also if you could identify a positive disruptive factor that may not have been foreseen, but is something that you are potentially going to take forward in the future of post-pandemic work. So Let's start with Dan, simply because we only have 30 minutes of Dan's time. So let's start with Dan. And Dan, can you give us a positive and a negative disruptor at Cruise?
Sure. We can start with the negative because that's pretty obvious. I think one of the big things for me is not having that time where you just walk by people's desks and you say hello. I guess it's like water cooler time to a certain extent. I hop from Zoom meeting or Google Hangout to Google Hangout, and you don't really have any time to get to know the people you're working with. And that's a huge loss for us, because we, essentially we don't get time to build trust outside of meetings or learn about people and connect with them. So that's a huge negative that we're actively, trying to do things like have team celebrations or, just 15 minutes at the beginning of the day where teams come together and chat just about whatever they want, or we spend, a few minutes at the beginning of every meeting going through, an icebreaker for the new people who we've never met in person before. On the positive side, and I think, this is pretty representative of what I'm doing right now, it's become okay to just be anywhere you want to be and take a meeting as long as you're productive, right? The FaceTime, I think, has gone away for us in a lot of ways. And I can call into a meeting, do what I need to do, and not have to commute to a certain place to have that interaction. So that's saved a lot of time. If you've ever been in San Francisco during rush hour, it can take 30 minutes to go across the city. So that's a lot of time saved if you don't have to commute.
Thanks, Dan. Let me ask Brittany next. We'll go in kind of reverse class order here. So Brittany, what's a positive as well as a negative that you all have experienced in the work that you do in the organization that you are in?
I get to wear comfortable clothes every day to work. That's a positive. Probably one of the few positives I think to come out of this pandemic, because, and I get to work from a place that I want to work from, which is, I was in the New York office, and my husband and I saw the opportunity to move to Los Angeles, where I've always wanted to move back to. Given what I do, I felt like being in New York was really important, but it no longer is as important, and my firm no longer cares as much where I am. So I came to the LA office. And so that's also been a positive, is that, and I've seen that across the firm. A partner actually was inspired by my move and came after me and moved to the Los Angeles office. So that's been positive. The negative, I just have to echo wholeheartedly what Dan said, because I think building, for the kind of, I guess, older generation in my office, senior associates and partners in my office, the not going into the office is a really big deal, because that's where you get training. That's where you build relationships. We are a large law firm, but everybody is almost an individual business too, right? You get business from your colleagues. And so building those relationships is actually really important. And the younger generation, the new junior associates, they don't want to come back to the office. In fact, a lot of them have moved permanently and are asking to work remotely. And I think they're missing out on that opportunity to build those relationships. And looking down on it, I also think, how do you keep a junior or a mid-level associate invested in the organization when they don't know the people or have connections with people that they're working with? So I see that as a negative.
Yeah, thanks for that. So you are LA Law now, huh? It's probably dating me in terms of that TV show, but that was always a favorite.
I'm formerly New York, LA, but based in LA, but I live in LA.
Okay. Well, you raise up some interesting issues around relationships and potentially around culture, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But let's go next to Michelle and tell us what's going on in the world of professional services and consulting.
Yeah, I think building on what Dan and Brittany both said with respect to that lack of connectedness or community that you have quite naturally when you're actually in the office, and for us, when you're traveling with your teams together or finding yourselves meeting up in airport lounges, on your way to or from a client site, I think what we've noticed is that's really led to higher attrition rates. I think because that lack of connectedness means, a lack of engagement. So, recognizing that with higher employee engagement, your attrition is a lot lower. I think we've seen more of an exodus than we had in prior years. And I think that's having all kinds of downstream effects, right? Our ability to be able to, to have that pool of resources to pull from to staff our engagements, I think has certainly been a challenge. I think on the flip side of that, recognizing that we're all, Dan's calling from a car right now, and, Brittany was able to move, and there's this increased flexibility. I think it's also increase just that level of vulnerability because we're all in our homes or wherever we might happen to be. I think it's allowed us to be a little bit more personal and get a little bit more insight into just the more personal sides of everyone, so whether it's seeing someone with their pet on their lap or their child kind of hanging out with them and wanting to see what mom and dad do or who mom and dad work with, I think that's been the fun part of it, is getting to know, the personal side of the people that we work with. And it's made us, I think, a little bit more real. And so hopefully, I don't know that we're at a point yet where that's offsetting the lack of connectedness, but, hopefully we can get to that point where people can feel much more real and much more comfortable and happy to be seeing our colleagues, in shorts and t-shirts or baseball caps, and know that that's okay.
Indeed. JM, you're in a family business. What are some things, that you found that have been a positive, as well as some things that have been, a negative for someone who's running a family business?
Yeah, I mean, David, thank you, and glad to be here with everybody. There are a lot of positives and a lot of negatives, so it's a little bit hard to pick the one on each side. And I don't take direction very well, so I may not keep it exactly to one. But and I also look at things, as a family office, what I really have more insight into is the portfolio companies and how they're all reacting to it, as opposed to we ourselves. We're pretty small in terms of our organization. It was very easy, in fact, to all go remote only. We have 3 offices around the world, and they're all remote, and we don't intend to go back in person. And that's neither positive nor negative. It's just very practical. I think, on the negative side, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that it's made us all a lot less global. Not only are we not traveling, but we're also kind of looking at things in a much smaller arena. So we're looking at, the schools in our district, are they opening, reopening? What are the infection rates in our county, in our state? To some extent, we look at things from a national point of view, and certainly here in the U.S., we're very focused on our own issues at the moment. But I've genuinely found that this pandemic has been more localizing in many ways than globalizing. And I think that that's a negative. I think that's a big negative. I mean, we have an office here in Santa Barbara, California, and people are back to normal 80%, and we'll be back to normal 100% very, very soon, whatever that means. It's the vaccination has been hugely successful, in the US. I have an office in Bombay, India. It's in the middle of probably one of the worst experiences in the world in terms of this pandemic. And, it's June of 2021, and they're in the midst of it. It's really very different. But I think we can all agree that it's hardly in the news, right? It's hardly in front of us. And so that's what I kind of meant by it's very localizing and less globalizing in terms of how this has affected us. I think that's hugely negative. On the positive side, from my perspective, Business in general tends to take events like this and uses them as an excuse, and as a good excuse, right? So in the 2008 global financial crisis, a lot of companies went bankrupt. A lot of companies took advantage of a crisis to readjust, to reset on cost, to reset on structure. The airline industry is a perfect example. There were a lot of airlines that went bankrupt in 2008 and reemerged, and a lot of airlines shut down their not so profitable lines, and it was a great excuse to kind of bring the whole business down back to basics. Then it grew and bloated again, and during the pandemic, it's been an amazing excuse for businesses to reduce cost and inefficiencies. The difference is that in this case, it's being paid for by future generations. And I don't mean that to sound like a political economic comment. It's not. It's more factual. It's under the cover of a huge level of support, companies are able to become much more efficient. And I think that's a huge positive, because when things are going well, it's very hard for companies to reduce cost in certain areas. And this has been an enormous efficiency creator among multiple businesses. I've seen that. And I think that there's some stickiness to it. So I consider that a positive.
Thank you. I want to follow up with that and build on some recent research published by McKinsey that said that the pandemic has accelerated trends in remote work, in e-commerce, automation, with 25% more workers than previously estimated, potentially needing to switch occupations. So that means translates globally to about 100 million workers, or 1 in 16, they estimate may have to change occupations by the year 2030. And job growth in the future going forward will be mainly in high-skilled jobs, raising further questions about potentially increasing income disparity around the world. And I know we don't have any labor economists on the panel, but we have a lot of experienced managers and leaders. I want to start again with Dan, because I realize his time is limited. And from the crew's perspective, Dan, are you planning, is Cruise planning to change anything about its human capital skills mix going forward? Are there any expected future changes in regard to the kinds of skills that you'll be looking for as you continue to staff and grow?
So Cruise specifically, probably not. And the reason I say that is we actually run ourselves very much like a high-tech company, right? Most of our people are already high-skill coders. We've got almost 2,000 people. Probably over half of them are engineers or engineering background type people. And we operate, we're building this cutting-edge technology, and that's always required to consider the kind of higher labor force. The question gets interesting because if we do our jobs right, there's obviously a lot of jobs out there in driving and whatnot that are going to need to be or will be fulfilled by robots. And so it's not a new question. I think we're seeing this shift across, as you mentioned, globally across multiple industries. And the good thing is that, those jobs are not actually jobs that people really want. And so we have to think kind of more at a macro level about how we retrain people to do these different jobs that are going to be needed in the future. So, I guess the short answer specifically for us is, and I think tech in general is really that we're not really seeing a different distribution in any kind of meaningful way, really. But over the long run, as a society, we're going to have to figure out how to retrain people and help them find new employment as robots and automation take over not just driving, but basically all these jobs.
Thank you, Dan. The other panelists, what do you see in terms of the companies that you work with? I mean, JM and Michelle both see a portfolio of different companies, and Brittany's obviously working in a highly disrupted area of law where a lot of these lower level jobs have already been outsourced, and there's a big trend towards automation of some basic level kinds of skills. What do you see around the human capital skills mix going forward, and what do you see in terms of potential implications, as Dan mentioned, for new approaches to training?
I mean, I can start, JM, if you're okay with that. And interesting, with what Dan shared, I think as I think about just the work that we're doing with our clients, it's almost not that different from what Dan shared, as far as it's not necessarily the pandemic that we were working with our clients with respect to automation, before the pandemic. And so that was certainly something that, was already on our radar, and our own practitioners that we brought on board to be able to support those transformations to move to more automated work. I think what we're seeing overall is, as those more sort of transactional rote activities get automated, what that means and how that translates for employees for their roles today or after the automation, and really getting to think differently about their roles, to be more insightful and analytic, to be much more strategic, and working with our clients to really help them make that shift from, I derive value in my day from being able to do these very transactional tasks, to I'm now going to be measured on the, maybe the strategic insights that I'm pulling from the new system that's being implemented, and how can I be a better strategic partner for the businesses that I work with. And I think, to Dan's point, thinking through different strategies on not just training, but onboarding, as we, I think we're probably going to get into some discussions around, overall talent strategies, but how do we create almost more bespoke learning experiences for folks in ways that are really going to resonate for them, because, we've got different generations in the workforce, and they're all going to need to learn differently. But I think it certainly allows us to think differently about learning approaches and digital learning approaches, and how we can create them to be a little bit more immersive than you might think with digital training strategies.
Thanks, Michelle. JM or Brittany?
Yeah, I think I would add that it has absolutely felt like an accelerating period of time towards automation. And I can't think of a single area or field where that trend hasn't accelerated, and the move towards automation hasn't been more adopted. The relationship to the pandemic is hard to pinpoint, in the sense that it was occurring. Again, I think it was a period of adjustment and restructuring, and I think that as business effectively halted for a little while, as we faced what was a very uncertain time, I think companies were able, especially the good companies, were able to quickly analyze what adjustments they wanted to make. And I think if you look at this in kind of a broader term as to the vulnerability of us as human beings, and there's a pretty clear and good reason why you want to continue to automate tasks that otherwise make your business kind of vulnerable. So I think, again, under the thesis of almost an excuse, it was a good period of review and restructuring and an acceleration towards automation. I've seen that absolutely everywhere.
Is that the case in the legal field, Brittany?
No. I would say the legal field is very much, we're kind of still doing things the same way that we've always done. So, we're lawyers, as kind of Dan pointed out, high-skilled professionals. Yeah. So the mix of human capital skills hasn't really changed from the law firm perspective. I do represent a wide variety portfolio of clients. And I've seen this, some shift in human capital skills with some industries, but by and large, I represent a lot of tech companies, for example, by the way, all probably similar to Dan's environment, where, again, not a huge shift in human capital skills, because, it's very high skilled professions.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk next about organizational culture. I mean, people like myself who consider themselves organizational scholars, as well as those in practice, talk about organizational culture as a potential source of sustainable competitive advantages, regardless of industry. If employees remain remote, as JM is saying in terms of his family business, or in some sort of hybrid model where there's a few days at home, a few days at work, what are the implications for your culture? And are there any discussions or any plans about interventions to address cultural issues? And let me again go first to Dan, because I know his time is limited. Dan, is there anything that in the high-tech industry and in your business around either the onboarding or other kinds of interventions to sustain and build a stronger culture at Cruise?
Yeah, definitely. Some of the things we've started doing, so for some context, we've onboarded probably about 500 people since the pandemic happened. And so almost a quarter of our company has not met another cruiser in person, potentially, right? They might be friends with them or have gone outside of Cruise, but they haven't gone to the office, haven't really seen anything. And so one of the things we struggle with is how do they get the energy? How do they understand what Cruise is about, what we're building? And so we're very intentional about our onboarding process and the information we share, as well as on my team in particular, we spend a lot of time reaching out to people and connecting with no particular agenda. And it might feel like busy work, but this is the way that we connect with our employees who are new and also who are still there as we can't come back. I think the implications for long term are, we keep going back and forth on this because I think in a lot of ways, you have to offer some level of remote work in order to be competitive. We're seeing that with like Facebook, Google, Amazon, allowing people to go more remote. But for us, there's a value for being in the office because we have a very physical product. Additionally, if you look at kind of the younger, kind of new grad, early professional people, being in the office is an advantage. It's where you build the relationships, as we talked about earlier, and you kind of learn how you should be working, right? If you just do that remotely, it's kind of like self-study to a certain extent, and not everyone excels at study. So those are a lot of things that we're thinking about as we return to work. We actually are going to return to work and open the office, but we have also allowed people to apply to work remotely. So kind of doing a mix of that at our company right now. And unfortunately, I gotta hop off. But thank you very much. This was super interesting. And,
Dan, thanks for your time.
Everybody.
Much appreciated. Glad you arrived safely. Panelists, what are your thoughts on this? Maybe I'll go to Michelle, because I know you work in this space. And not only are you in an organization, you work with a lot of organizations in kind of the people professional services area. Are companies more concerned about this? Have they been reaching out about, culture issues and so forth?
Yeah, we've actually been doing a lot of work in this space. So both internally as a firm, but then with our clients. And some of the questions that we get, and I think Dan touched on it, is a couple of things. So when it comes to, talent acquisition strategies, just recognizing we have an opportunity to really diversify our talent pool if we think about going more broadly and having a more remote workforce, or at least a hybrid workforce. So we're not necessarily married to our geo in recruiting talent, but we can go a little bit more broadly. But what it does raise is, while we're typically used to, and I'm using we in our client sense, hearing from our clients, we are a collaborative culture and we're used to being in person. And everything that we've heard, Dan and Jam and Brittany say is we build, our careers through networking and understanding and modeling what we see, next to us. That how do we do that and how do we manage that if we're now in this remote situation? How do we create onboarding experiences that are connecting and engaging? And so they're all questions that I think our clients are wrestling with. We as EY are wrestling with that as well, and trying to understand, and define a new way of working. And how does that translate into how we recruit talent? And, I had this morning and a whole interview day, where we were doing it all virtually, and, we'll be moving in that direction. But, how do you then manage performance discussions, where a lot of times it's, those are the sorts of discussions, and sometimes if you're delivering hard feedback, that you want to do in person, or we recently just announced that our promotions to partner, and being able to have those sorts of celebrations in person that you don't get, that you will now be doing virtually. I think we've got to make much more concerted and intentional efforts to create that community and connection, and to help people understand, to Brittany's point, how do you provide that mentorship now in a hybrid model, and still create enough flexibility for those who want to and need to be remote a couple days a week, but thinking about even just the overall real estate footprint and how you set up your offices to be more collaborative and be places that people can go and still feel connected.
Brittany or JM, thoughts on culture?
Yeah, we have a lot of things in connection with the pandemic, particularly in what I do in my field, have kind of collided at the same time. And I mean, the pandemic happened, but you also had an increased intensity of capital markets work that has resulted, my work day went from 10 to 15 hours a day to 20 hours a day, almost 7 days a week. So it's an intense work environment. And then of course you also have in the backdrop, a lot of discussions, that were not because of COVID, about race relations, the Me Too movement. All of these things are kind of coming together at once, where even without COVID, people are reevaluating their culture and the way they do things. I know like Latham has spent a lot of time thinking about how we run our organization and our culture. And, we represent a wide variety of clients that are thinking about that too. I mean, for all of the people that have left during the pandemic, in part because they, a lot of people are in New York for work. They're not in New York because they are New Yorkers that want to be there 100% of the time. And so we had a lot of people leave to go to other places. It kind of accelerated their leaving. And so we've had to replace a lot of people, and we've had to, my team is, I would say probably 50% of my team left, and they've been replaced by 50% new team members in a short period of time. And so, and because the market is so hot and the lateral market is so hot, we've been hiring people probably a bit more generously than we have in the past because the market. And so that's also, where we might really pay attention to whether somebody could kind of be, match with our culture. And, because we're always very conscious about that, now it's more about, okay, if you have the ability, well, hopefully he will integrate into our culture. And so trying to maintain that sense of culture during the pandemic has been hard because they haven't been into the office. They haven't seen, the way that we interact with each other. We've been trying to do, like, there are companies that will host kind of virtual team building events. So we did like a bingo game, which was honestly kind of a little bit silly, I have to say. Did not enjoy that one. We've been doing a lot more Zoom chats to try to build that sense of team within the firm. But it's definitely been a struggle and something we're still figuring out. In New York, we moved to a new office and completely renovated to have a more an office setting that was more conducive to being social. Just kind of like getting away from the traditional law firm look. And now, we have a lot of people that won't be going to that office. So we've invested a lot of resources in creating more open spaces in the office. And now I don't think we'll ever go back to 100% of the people in the office all the time. I think it'll be more like 100% of people will come in 2 days a week. And so, how our culture will change because of that, remains to be seen, but I think it's going to be really hard to keep people in the profession at the firm in the long term. I think you're going to see people job hopping more just because there's not that sense of connection. I'm still at the firm because I have relationships with partners, and I actually tried to quit at one point, and they my relationships with those partners, they were able to kind of recruit me back to the firm. But I don't see having those connections. I don't think it's going to be easy for people to make those connections in the long term. And because of that, they may feel more isolated and more willing to leave for other opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. Before I ask JM to comment, I just want to point out that Gallup does a lot of work around engagement surveys. And one of their items on their engagement audit is a question that they say is the single best predictor of whether somebody is going to leave an organization. And that item is, I have a best friend at work. And the more likely they are to say, I have a best friend at work, the less likely they are to leave. And that creates just the kinds of issues you're talking about, Brittany. If everybody's remote, will you have best friends at work going forward? So JM, you are geographically distributed. You're also signaled that you probably won't come back to live in the office. Any thoughts about how you're going to attend to culture going forward?
Yeah, again, it's much easier at my scale, right? Because if I have 12 people in an office, it's very easy for me to reach out to every single one of them and meet them at a coffee shop, or meet them for a walk on the beach, or meet them for a hike meeting, which has become a real thing. And it's much easier for me to solve it at that scale. But at the scale of portfolio companies, I think this issue of culture has been really interesting to me, because I'm a firm believer that culture at companies is so critical, and it's so hard to identify, it's so hard to pinpoint, it's so hard to describe. And yet I've seen some incredibly great companies in terms of product and technology with terrible culture, and it's almost the best predictor for me in terms of failure. Whereas I've seen some pretty average companies in terms of what they do with phenomenal culture that succeed incredibly well. And yet it's still hard for me to describe. So for me, I went, my career started in large firms, and memories of ordering dinner in conference rooms and sitting there and creating these relationships with mentors that Brittany mentions, right? Those were the most important and influencing relationships that I had at the time. And now, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a conversation with a set of 20 somethings in a pretty high growth company, a tech company. And it was kind of funny because, to a T, every single one of them said, "Ugh, culture, all you boomers talk about culture. I don't really care, they were like, I'm happy to work remote, come in, you guys talk about culture, but for me, it's about technology and what we do and what we stand for, less so than the work culture." It was very interesting to me that they had such a different reaction to it. I felt very old at the time. But I think also, the intentionality of companies really comes out, right? I think a lot of companies, good management teams have really tried to build relationships with their teams, right? As Brittany says, whether it's somewhat failed attempts at bingo nights. I've seen, I had a company do a 24/7 open screen for everybody that was meant to give the feeling that if I'm sitting at this desk, I'm sitting next to that person at the desk, and I might lean over and say, "Hey, what did you think of the baseball game last night?" That really didn't work very well. It felt more like spying and an invasion of privacy than it did a true successful open channel relationship. Yeah. I mentioned last time at the leadership meeting, one company in particular, it's about a 2,500 person tech company. It's grown rapidly throughout the pandemic. They really transformed their culture completely by taking advantage of remote work and opening up their meetings to attendance by all. And the original intent was that if I'm walking into my boss's, my direct report's office, then that's a private meeting. Yeah. And so if the company cares about imparting the knowledge that is exchanged or the culture that is created, then why not have that conversation witnessed or visited by others, not necessarily participating, but visited. And it created an interesting culture so that every meeting, and there'd be software development meeting, sales meeting, HR meeting, a finance meeting, and every employee could attend every meeting. All you have to do is look at the schedule and click on it, and there you are. You're listening in and watching. The only limitations were legal limitations where securities issues were involved, or IP type issues like that. But fundamentally, it created, initially people thought it was ridiculous. People thought, how do I know who's listening in or who's talking? Well, you can see it on the screen, but that seemed distracting. It's turned into a great success story. In general, the employees that adjusted have loved it. And it's really interesting that as an employee, as a new employee in this company, you can actually listen to the CEO have a meeting with his CFO and talk about the intimate details of the financial workings of the company. It's really interesting. It sounds kind of frightening to some of us, but it actually has provided a transparency culture in that company that is hard to imagine.
Yeah,
So,
radical transparency for real. And there are some out there like Ray Dalio at Bridgewater who say that is the future in organizations. I know we haven't had a chance to really talk about leadership implications, and I do want to leave time for Q&A from our audience, and maybe that will transition into some questions that they have about what have you learned around leadership, how do you lead better in a post-pandemic world. But Evan, do you have some questions for our panelists?
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of our panelists. If anyone has a question, please do either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand in the participant section. We'd love to see your hands raised. We're going to go to the chat first, and then we'll go to Brian, who raised his hand. Sam Brooksmith says, to me, the question becomes, how do we create and drive to the culture the firm wants and feels it needs versus adjusting where we work and seeing how the culture evolves? In other words, what are the best practices for leaders to shape the culture and not have it be done to them? If you need to read it, it's in the very bottom of the chat piece.
I mean, I'll take a lead here while the panelists ponder that one. I mean, I think a great example is what Jan was just talking about in terms of this notion of going to radical transparency. I mean, that was a decision that was made at the top that we're going to open things up, which has potentially the advantages of building a lot of trust and psychological safety in that particular organization. But as a leader, those are the kinds of decisions that are they seem risky, and maybe they are, but they have the potential for big rewards and resetting in a whole different way going forward.
Yeah, and I add to that, and I think, I appreciated, Sam, what you put in the chat as far as, it's not really where we work. If we define culture is really more how we work as opposed to where we work. The example JM gives is a great one. I think the other one outside of transparency would be about trust, and how do we as leaders, now especially because we're in a virtual environment where we're not co-located with our teams, we've got to be much more mindful and intentional and trusting of our teams. Actually had a conversation today just before this call with someone on our team who was asking that same question. Like, I want to be able to trust and empower my teams to just get the work done. We've got to be flexible because we know that everyone has competing demands at home. And there's a whole lot going on, and we have to respect everyone's boundaries. But at the end of the day, if the work needs to get done, it needs to get done. And she was asking the question, how do I find that balance between trusting and empowering my teams to do the work? But then there's still, on the opposite side of that, as a team member, I still have to hold myself accountable to delivery. So I think that we've got to figure that out. But, I think trust is another big one for me with my teams, and even with my clients, because our clients have very, high expectations about our ability to deliver, and being remote should not impact that at all. And I've had to be very open and transparent about my own personal commitments, but let them know and be able to build their trust through delivery and having, building that credibility with them that we will be able to deliver. So a lot of that comes with just modeling that as a leader and just doing it, with the example that JM gave.
Yeah, there's been a lot of, I think the tone at the top has really changed, and the messaging that we get over and over and over again is about, kind of like a, don't, if people have kids in the background, like be respectful of that, like don't kind of show disapproval of that. There have been a lot more messagings about how to be a better supervisor. Don't kind of ask people, now that we're starting to return to the office, don't ask people or shame people who are working from home, or make them feel like they need to be in the office. Ensure that everybody is getting personal time, because law firms across the board are insanely busy. And people have really been, like I said, I've been going from 20-hour day to 20-hour days, 7 days a week. So a lot of tone at the top about making sure that people get at least one day, off and away from their desk and their computer. And so there's just been a lot of messaging about, when you call people that work on your teams, like don't just call them to talk about the deal, like put time aside for a phone call where you're calling them just to talk about, to catch up. And you're not at the end of that call saying, and also I have this assignment for you. That was something that we just got an email about that yesterday. So we do 360 reviews. And so the firm has been looking at that feedback and not only providing personal feedback to individuals, but also consolidating kind of like best practices and most complained about, things that are most complained about, and sharing it with the firm as a whole, and saying, okay, we need to be sure that we're improving on these things as a firm as a whole. And we also, here's some great things that we've seen people do during the pandemic that have really helped. So, a lot more partners have been reaching out to just do one-on-one Zooms and not talk about work.
Right. We have a question from Brian. Brian, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, coming to you from Panama. So hello from the tropics. All the talk about culture and thinking about this line between the old folks and the young folks, and how these youngsters they don't have the same dedication to institution and so on. It's making me think in some ways about those crazy people at Google a few years ago who, they weren't wearing ties and they had playgrounds in the office buildings and so on. In my field, in education, particularly international education, before the pandemic, I spent a lot of time talking with educators about how education needs to change, and educators need to understand our role in preparing students for futures in work for the next several decades has to move forward instead of looking back on 20th century norms. And one of those things, going back to the culture conversations, how we need to prepare them for careers that are basically spent as independent contractors, jumping from one job to another job to another job, and maybe from an industry to another industry to another industry. And so in that sense, I'm just curious whether you think the pandemic was in and of itself a disruptor, or whether it was simply an accelerator of things that have been in the works for a while.
I think it's an accelerator, especially when I think about trends like work-life balance, which is something that I think law firms historically haven't had. But I think with the younger generations coming in, they do not and are very vocal about protecting their time in a way that even when I was a junior, I was like, oh my gosh, I would never say that to a partner. I would always just say yes, right? I would never, and there was a summer associate the other day, a very senior partner emailed the summer associate, was like, hey, I have this deal, interested in working on it. He emailed at 7 p.m. She did not reply back until 4:30 p.m. the next day. And then she said, Yeah, I'm interested, but I'm on this one deal, and I've been busy on this one deal, and so I will not have availability for a week. And I chuckled a little bit because I was like, wow, it took almost 24 hours to reply back to him. And also she was on one deal and not, we manage 7 to 10 deals. So it was a little, but very, and the partner was not offended at all. And, he kind of gets that things are changing, and we kind of see that. But, all of our summer associates are very, well, I'm on one or I'm on two things. And, I'm only going to work from this time to this time. And so just really placing a lot more boundaries on their time up front. And asking a lot more questions about, like, how long is this assignment going to take? When is it going to end? And trying to manage their time more. And we saw that before the pandemic, but I see it a lot more now with our first and second and third year associates. So I hope that trickles upwards, but the truth of the matter is that even our clients who really claim that they're, even our work-life balance clients, they never, with their service providers, that emphasis on work-life balance, it never goes but to their service providers. I will say that. So it's been interesting managing our clients, but then dealing with the workforce that wants to be more work-life focused.
All right, we have time for one last question. It comes from Pam Tanas, class of '88. Hello, Pam. How do you see the future of independent work, those that are 1099, after the pandemic? Will more employees leave their work to go out on their own because they want to control their work environment, or something else?
I mean, I think if this question's tied in some ways to the question that Brian asked, as far as, this acceleration of this movement of job to job. And if I go 1099, I've got a little bit more control. I think it's a possibility, but I think that organizations, ours included, are being that much more mindful of how we create all the things that we've been talking about, create those connections and increase employee engagement, so that likelihood of jumping and going from one place to another, joining the gig economy to just do whatever and have control. I think if we can afford that kind of flexibility within our own workplace and create that sense of community, hopefully that there'll be a lot less likelihood to move into other opportunities or to completely pull myself out to be, self-employed and control my own destiny that way.
Let me say something on that, because I teach, among the other things that I do here at CMC, I teach a course on organizational psychology. And a topic in that course is, what's the 21st century career going to look like? And now it's like, what is the 21st century career post-pandemic going to look like? And there are people who say it's no longer going to be a ladder. It's more like, and JM will like this analogy, it's more like surfing. It's like a wave will come of some new and important thing, and you've got to catch the wave. That means you've got to be agile, you have to be facile, you have to be a voracious learner to catch that wave, capitalize on that, and then know when to get off the wave and wait for the next one to come. So I think if you believe that kind of approach to thinking about careers in the future, it's really not just staying in one company, but even in staying in one field for your entire career.
Thanks, David. And we do have 1 minute left. And I just thought I would kind of end with what happens to an organization, in your opinion, that returns to pre-pandemic levels, business as usual, no flexibility? What should they expect to see?
I mean, I think they're going to see a lot of attrition, quite frankly. I mean, we know from all the different surveys that are out there. I mean, we did a survey to 16,000 employees across 16 countries, and the feedback came back without some sort of flexibility. We returned to exactly the way we were. Over 2/3 of them said they'd leave. So I think there's a compelling reason for us to really think about how to work differently coming out of this.
Great. Anything else from our panel. Any final words of wisdom for our audience? Otherwise, I will extend my sincere thanks on behalf of the college to all of you, and a reminder that KLI is one of our 11 independently endowed research institutes at CMC. If you ever want to support the work of our incredible institutes, please consider doing so. You can go to cmc.edu and click giving or click donate and send your support to our 11 independently endowed institutes. They're doing so much for our faculty and so much for our students, and they can always deserve your help. And thanks to our individuals here who've supported KLI for a number of years. So with that, feel free to unmute, say hello, say goodbye, and we will see you all next week.